The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as young Prince George walked quietly toward the main entrance. At just 11 years old, he carried himself with a grace that seemed far beyond his years. The palace guards stood at attention, their red uniforms pristine and their faces stoic as always. But today felt different somehow. George had always been fascinated by the guards who protected his family. While other children his age were captivated by video games or sports, he found himself drawn to these silent sentinels who stood watch over the royal grounds day and night. He had watched them through palace windows during countless rainy afternoons, noting how they never seemed to waver, never seemed to tire. The young prince had a secret that even his parents didn't fully understand. Despite his royal upbringing and all the privileges that came with it, George possessed an unusual sensitivity to the feelings of others. He could sense when someone was struggling, when they were in pain, or when they needed kindness. It was as if he had been born with an invisible antenna that picked up on human emotions. On this particular morning, as George approached the main gate, he noticed something troubling about Guard Thompson. The man stood as rigid as ever, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his rifle held at the precise angle required by protocol, but George could see what others missed. There was a slight tremor in the guard's hands, barely noticeable but definitely there. His breathing seemed labored, and though his face remained expressionless, there was something in his eyes that spoke of deep exhaustion. Guard Thompson had been serving the royal family for over 15 years. He was known among his colleagues as one of the most dedicated and reliable members of the Queen's Guard. Never late, never absent, never breaking protocol. But recently, life had become increasingly difficult for him. His wife had been diagnosed with a serious illness, requiring expensive treatments that stretched their family budget to its limits. He had been working extra shifts, picking up additional duties wherever possible just to make ends meet. The stress was taking its toll. Thompson hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. He would finish his shift at the palace, rush to the hospital to sit with his wife, then return home to care for their 2 young children. By morning, he would be back at his post, standing guard over the royal family while his own family struggled. George had been observing this pattern for several days now. While adults rushed past the guards without a second glance, treating them almost like living statues, the young prince had developed a habit of really looking at them. He noticed the small details that others missed. He saw the fatigue in Thompson's shoulders, the way he occasionally closed his eyes for just a moment longer than a normal blink, the subtle signs that this strong man was reaching his breaking point. The palace was bustling with its usual morning activity. Staff members hurried back and forth preparing for another day of royal duties. Tourists gathered outside the gates hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. Inside, his parents were busy with their own responsibilities, managing the countless obligations that came with their positions. But George couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about Guard Thompson. The man's dedication was admirable, but the young prince could see that he was suffering in silence. It reminded George of something his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, had once told him about true nobility. She had said that real strength wasn't about never needing help, but about knowing when to ask for it and being brave enough to accept it when it was offered. As George continued his walk through the palace grounds, he found himself thinking about the responsibilities that would one day be his. He knew that being a future king meant more than wearing crowns and attending ceremonies. It meant caring for people, understanding their struggles, and using whatever power he had to make their lives better. The young prince had always been taught about duty and service, but he was beginning to understand these concepts in a deeper way. He realized that true leadership wasn't about commanding from a distance, but about seeing the humanity in every person around him, including those whose job it was to protect and serve his family. That afternoon, George made a decision that would surprise everyone around him and ultimately change Guard Thompson's life forever. But first, he needed to understand more about what the man was going through. The young prince had learned that the best way to help someone was to first truly understand their situation. As evening approached and the palace began to settle into its quieter nighttime rhythm, George positioned himself by a window where he could observe the changing of the guard. He watched as Thompson's shift came to an end, noting the man's obvious relief mixed with continued worry. The guard's shoulders sagged slightly as he walked away from his post. and George could see the weight of his troubles in every step. The young prince knew that tomorrow would bring an opportunity to act on the compassion that had been growing in his heart. He had a plan forming in his mind, one that would require courage, wisdom, and the kind of quiet strength that he was still learning to develop. It was the beginning of a gesture that would touch not only Guard Thompson's life, but would also demonstrate to the entire palace community what true royal character really looked like. The next morning arrived with a gentle drizzle that made the palace grounds glisten like jewels. Prince George woke earlier than usual, his mind already focused on the plan he had been developing throughout the night. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would allow him to move freely around the palace without drawing too much attention to himself. George had learned from his parents that the best way to understand someone's situation was to observe and listen before taking action. So instead of immediately approaching Guard Thompson, the young prince decided to spend the day gathering information. He wanted to understand not just what he could see on the surface, but the full scope of the challenges the guard was facing. His first stop was the palace kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson, the head cook, was already preparing breakfast for the staff. Mrs. Patterson had worked at the palace for nearly 20 years and knew almost everything that happened within its walls. She had a kind heart and often served as an unofficial counselor to staff members who were struggling with personal problems. George approached her with the respectful manner his parents had taught him to use with all palace employees. Mrs. Patterson was initially surprised to see the young prince in her kitchen so early, but she welcomed him warmly. George had always been her favorite among the royal children because of his genuine interest in the people around him. Through their conversation, George learned that Mrs. Patterson had indeed noticed Guard Thompson's recent struggles. She mentioned that he had been declining invitations to join other guards for their usual coffee breaks, and that she had seen him making phone calls during his lunch periods that seemed to leave him looking more worried than before. Mrs. Patterson also revealed something that made George's heart ache. She had overheard Thompson talking to another guard about having to choose between paying for his wife's medications and buying proper winter coats for his children. The guard had been trying to keep his voice low, but Mrs. Patterson's keen ears had picked up on the conversation. Armed with this information, George felt even more determined to help, but he also realized that he needed to be very careful about how he approached the situation. Guard Thompson was a proud man who had dedicated his life to serving others. He would not want to be seen as someone who couldn't handle his responsibilities, and he certainly wouldn't want to burden the royal family with his personal problems. The young prince spent the rest of the morning observing Thompson more closely. He positioned himself in various locations around the palace where he could watch the guard without being obvious about it. What he saw confirmed his suspicions and deepened his concern. During his break, Thompson sat alone on a bench in the palace gardens, his head in his hands. George could see the man's shoulders shaking slightly, and he realized that the stoic guard was quietly crying. It was a moment of such private vulnerability that George felt almost guilty for witnessing it, but it also strengthened his resolve to find a way to help. George also noticed that Thompson's uniform, while still meeting the strict standards required of the Queen's Guard, was showing signs of wear that suggested he couldn't afford to replace certain items. His boots were well polished but had been resoled multiple times. His gloves had small repairs that had been carefully stitched by hand. In the afternoon, George did something that surprised the palace staff. He approached Captain Morrison, the head of the Queen's Guard, and requested a private meeting. Captain Morrison had known George since he was a small child and had always been impressed by the boy's maturity and thoughtfulness. During their meeting, George spoke with a wisdom that belied his young age. He didn't immediately reveal his concerns about Thompson, but instead asked Captain Morrison to tell him more about the guards' working conditions, their families, and the challenges they might face in their personal lives. Captain Morrison was touched by the young prince's genuine interest and concern. He explained that while the palace tried to support its staff as much as possible, there were limits to what they could do officially. Many of the guards, he admitted, were too proud to ask for help, even when they desperately needed it. This conversation gave George the insight he needed to formulate his plan. He realized that any help offered to Thompson would need to be done in a way that preserved the man's dignity, while still providing real, meaningful assistance. That evening, George wrote a letter. But it wasn't addressed to Guard Thompson. Instead, it was addressed to his father, Prince William. In the letter, George explained what he had observed and learned about Thompson's situation. He wrote about the guard's dedication, his quiet suffering, and his obvious love for his family. But George didn't just present the problem. He also proposed a solution. He had been thinking about his own allowance, money that he had been saving for months with no particular purpose in mind. He asked his father if there was a way to use this money to help Thompson's family without making it obvious that the assistance was coming from the royal family. George suggested that the help could be presented as part of a palace employee assistance program, or perhaps as a community fund that had been established to help staff members during difficult times. The key was to make sure that Thompson could accept the help without feeling like he was receiving charity or that his job security was in any way dependent on accepting assistance. The letter also revealed something remarkable about the young prince's character. He didn't want any recognition for his gesture. He specifically asked his father to ensure that Thompson never knew the assistance had come from him personally. George wrote that the satisfaction of knowing he had helped someone who had dedicated his life to protecting his family was reward enough. As George sealed the letter and placed it on his father's desk, he felt a mixture of nervousness and hope. He knew that what he was proposing was unusual, and he wasn't entirely sure how his parents would respond. But he also knew that doing nothing would mean watching a good man continue to suffer in silence. The young prince went to bed that night with a sense of anticipation. Tomorrow would bring answers, and hopefully it would also bring relief to a man whose quiet strength and dedication had touched the heart of a future king. Prince William found his son's letter early the next morning, as he prepared for his daily briefings. The sight of George's careful handwriting immediately caught his attention, but nothing could have prepared him for the contents of what he read. As he absorbed every word, William felt a deep pride in his eldest son that went far beyond typical parental affection. The letter revealed a level of empathy and social awareness that impressed William greatly. But more than that, it showed that George had inherited something precious from his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, the ability to see beyond titles and positions to the human beings underneath. William realized that his son was developing the kind of character that would make him not just a future king, but a true leader. William immediately called for a private meeting with Catherine, George's mother. Together, they read the letter again, discussing not just George's observations about Guard Thompson, but what this entire situation revealed about their son's developing sense of responsibility and compassion. Catherine was particularly moved by George's request for anonymity. In a world where good deeds were often publicized and used for positive publicity, their 11-year-old son wanted nothing more than to help someone quietly and without recognition. It was a maturity that both parents found remarkable and deeply touching. After much discussion, William and Catherine decided to support George's plan, but with some modifications that would make it even more effective. They would indeed present the assistance as part of a palace employee welfare program, but they would also ensure that the help was substantial enough to make a real difference in Thompson's family situation. William called Captain Morrison into a private meeting that afternoon. Without revealing George's involvement, he discussed the possibility of establishing a discretionary fund to help staff members who were facing personal hardships. He mentioned that such a program would align with the royal family's values and their commitment to caring for the people who served them so faithfully. Captain Morrison was enthusiastic about the idea, particularly when William suggested that Guard Thompson might be an appropriate first recipient of such assistance. The captain had been aware of Thompson's struggles, but had felt helpless to address them within the existing palace protocols. Meanwhile, George continued his quiet observations of Thompson. The guard's condition seemed to be worsening each day. His usually perfect posture was beginning to show signs of fatigue, and during one particularly long shift, George saw him discreetly lean against a wall for support when he thought no one was looking. The young prince also noticed something else that strengthened his resolve. Despite his obvious exhaustion and worry, Thompson never let his personal struggles affect his professional performance. He was still the first to arrive for his shifts and the last to leave. He still maintained the highest standards of appearance and behavior. His dedication in the face of personal adversity was truly remarkable. On Thursday afternoon, George witnessed something that made him realize how urgent the situation had become. During Thompson's break, the guard received a phone call that was clearly about his wife's medical condition. George was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could see Thompson's face growing pale as he listened. When the call ended, the man sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the ground with an expression of deep despair. That evening, George approached his father with a sense of urgency. He asked if the assistance plan could be implemented immediately, explaining that he was concerned about Thompson's well-being. William assured his son that arrangements were already in motion and that help would reach Thompson very soon. The next morning brought the moment that would change everything for Guard Thompson. Captain Morrison called him into his office before his shift began. Thompson entered with some apprehension, wondering if his recent struggles had somehow affected his performance in ways he hadn't realized. Captain Morrison began by praising Thompson's long service and dedication to the royal family. He spoke about the Guard's impeccable record and his reputation among his colleagues as someone who could always be relied upon. Thompson listened with growing confusion, unsure where this conversation was leading. Then Captain Morrison explained about the new employee assistance program that had been established by the palace administration. He described it as a fund designed to help dedicated staff members who were facing temporary hardships that were beyond their control. The program, he explained, was intended to ensure that loyal employees could focus on their important work without being overwhelmed by personal financial pressures. Thompson's initial reaction was one of suspicion and pride. He began to protest that he didn't need charity and that he was perfectly capable of handling his own problems. But Captain Morrison was prepared for this response. He explained that the assistance wasn't charity. It was an investment in valued employees, a way of ensuring that the palace retained its best people during difficult times. The captain also mentioned that accepting the assistance was completely voluntary and confidential. No one outside of the immediate administration would know about it, and it would in no way affect Thompson's employment status or future opportunities. Most importantly, the fund was specifically designed to help employees like Thompson, who had proven their worth through years of dedicated service. As the details of the assistance package were explained, Thompson felt overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and gratitude. The financial help would cover his wife's medical expenses for the next several months and provide additional support for his family's immediate needs. It was exactly what they had been praying for, arriving at exactly the moment when they needed it most. Thompson's composure, maintained through years of military training and professional discipline, finally began to crack. Tears formed in his eyes as he realized that someone had noticed his struggles and cared enough to help. For the first time in months, he felt hope instead of desperation. Unknown to Thompson, Prince George was watching from a window as the guard emerged from Captain Morrison's office. The young prince could see the change in the man's demeanor immediately. Thompson's shoulders were straighter, his step was lighter, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there for weeks, relief and renewed purpose. That afternoon, George felt a satisfaction unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had learned something important about the power of compassion and the responsibility that came with privilege. But more than that, he had discovered that true strength often lay not in grand gestures or public displays, but in quiet acts of kindness that touched individual lives in meaningful ways. The transformation in Guard Thompson over the following weeks was remarkable to witness. George watched with quiet satisfaction as the man's posture improved. His step became more confident and the haunted look gradually disappeared from his eyes. The financial assistance had lifted an enormous burden from Thompson's shoulders, allowing him to focus on his duties without the constant anxiety about his family's well-being. But George also observed something unexpected happening. Thompson's renewed spirit seemed to be affecting the other guards as well. His colleagues noticed the positive change in their fellow guard and began asking him about his improved mood. Thompson, bound by the confidentiality of the assistance program, couldn't explain the specific reason for his improved circumstances, but his general attitude of gratitude and renewed purpose was infectious. The young prince realized he was witnessing something important about leadership and positive influence. One person's improved situation was creating a ripple effect that benefited the entire guard unit. Thompson's dedication had always been exemplary, but now it was coupled with a joy and energy that inspired those around him. During one of his regular walks through the palace grounds, George overheard a conversation between Thompson and a younger guard named Williams. Williams was asking Thompson about how he maintained such positive energy, despite the demanding nature of their work. Thompson's response revealed something that moved George deeply. Thompson spoke about the importance of gratitude and how sometimes, when life seemed darkest, unexpected help could arrive from the most surprising sources. He talked about the value of never giving up hope and about the responsibility they all had to support each other through difficult times. He mentioned that he had recently been reminded that there were always people watching out for them, even when they felt most alone. George realized that Thompson's experience was teaching him lessons that went beyond simple gratitude. The guard was becoming a source of wisdom and encouragement for his colleagues, sharing insights that could only come from someone who had experienced both desperation and unexpected rescue. The young prince also noticed changes in his own perspective during this time. He began paying closer attention to all the palace staff, wondering if others might be struggling with challenges he hadn't yet recognized. He started making an effort to acknowledge the workers he encountered each day, offering simple greetings and expressions of appreciation that seemed to brighten their responses. Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen was particularly pleased with this development. She mentioned to other staff members that Prince George seemed to be developing the kind of awareness and compassion that would serve him well in his future role. She predicted that he would grow up to be the kind of leader who truly understood the people he served. One afternoon, George decided to take his observations and learning to a new level. He approached his tutor, Mr. Henderson, and asked if they could incorporate lessons about social responsibility and community service into his educational program. He wanted to understand more about poverty, healthcare challenges, and the various struggles that ordinary families faced. Mr. Henderson was impressed by George's request and worked with Prince William and Catherine to develop an expanded curriculum that would give the young prince a broader understanding of social issues. This education would include visits to charities, hospitals, and community organizations where George could see firsthand how different people lived and what challenges they faced. Meanwhile, Thompson's family situation continued to improve dramatically. His wife's medical treatments were progressing well, thanks to the financial assistance that allowed them to access better care options. Their children were able to participate in school activities they had previously been unable to afford. For the first time in months, Thompson's family felt secure and hopeful about their future. The guard's improved personal circumstances also meant that he was sleeping better and eating more regularly. This physical recovery enhanced his already excellent job performance, making him an even more valuable member of the security team. Captain Morrison noted the improvement and privately wondered if the assistance program might be worth expanding to help other staff members who might be facing similar challenges. One evening, as George was walking past the guard post, something unexpected happened that would further deepen his understanding of Thompson's character. A tourist who had been taking photographs near the palace gates suddenly collapsed, apparently suffering from some kind of medical emergency. Without hesitation, Thompson broke from his rigid guard position and rushed to help the fallen tourist. He knelt beside the person, checked their breathing and pulse, and called for emergency medical assistance. While maintaining his concern for the tourist's well-being, he also ensured that palace security protocols were followed and that the situation didn't compromise the safety of the royal family. George watched this entire incident unfold and was struck by Thompson's immediate response to someone in need. Despite his formal role as a guard, Thompson's first instinct was to help another human being who was in distress. It was exactly the kind of character that had originally drawn George's attention and concern. The tourist recovered quickly and was extremely grateful for Thompson's quick thinking and care. Local news outlets picked up the story, praising the guard's professionalism and compassion. The incident brought positive attention to the entire Queen's Guard and reinforced the reputation of the Royal Protection Services. For George, this incident confirmed that his instincts about Thompson had been correct. The guard was not only dedicated to his professional duties but was also fundamentally a good person who cared about others. The assistance he had received had not just helped his family, it had preserved and strengthened a valuable member of the palace community. That night, George wrote another letter to his parents. This time, he wasn't asking for help with a specific problem. Instead, he was expressing his gratitude for their support of his original plan and sharing what he had learned from the entire experience. In the letter, George wrote about how helping Thompson had taught him that true leadership meant paying attention to the people around him and finding ways to support them when they needed it most. He mentioned that he was beginning to understand that being born into privilege meant having both opportunities and responsibilities that he should never take for granted. The young prince also expressed his desire to continue learning about the challenges that ordinary people faced and to find more ways to use his position to make a positive difference in their lives. He wrote that the satisfaction he felt from helping Thompson had shown him a path toward the kind of king he wanted to become, one who saw and cared for all his subjects, especially those who served quietly and faithfully without seeking recognition. As George sealed this second letter, he felt a sense of growth and purpose that was new to him. He was beginning to understand that his future role as king would be about much more than ceremony and tradition. It would be about using whatever power and influence he had to create a better world for everyone, starting with the people closest to him. Several months had passed since the assistance program had transformed Guard Thompson's life, and the positive changes continued to ripple throughout the palace community. George had been quietly observing these developments while also expanding his own understanding of service and leadership through his enhanced educational program. One crisp autumn morning, something extraordinary happened that would test everything George had learned about compassion, respect, and the true meaning of strength. As the young prince was walking through the palace gardens, he noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. Several guards were gathered in an animated discussion, and George could sense that something significant was happening. Approaching carefully so as not to interfere with official duties, George learned that Guard Thompson had just received devastating news. His wife, despite the excellent medical care she had been receiving, had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors were recommending an experimental treatment that offered hope, but it would require Thompson to take an extended leave of absence to care for his family during this critical time. The dilemma facing Thompson was heartbreaking. His wife desperately needed his support and presence during her treatment, but taking extended leave would mean losing his position with the Queen's Guard. Palace security positions required consistent availability, and extended absences, even for family emergencies, could result in permanent replacement. George watched as Thompson struggled with this impossible choice between his duty to his family and his commitment to his profession. The Guard had dedicated 15 years of his life to serving the royal family, and the Queen's Guard position provided not only his livelihood, but also his identity and sense of purpose. Captain Morrison was equally distressed by the situation. He valued Thompson's service and wanted to help, but palace protocols were clear about attendance requirements. The security needs of the royal family couldn't be compromised, even for compassionate reasons. It appeared that Thompson would have to choose between his wife's health and his career. That afternoon, George made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of writing another letter to his parents or working through official channels, he requested a direct meeting with his grandfather, King Charles. This was highly unusual, as George typically communicated with his grandfather through his parents or during regular family gatherings. King Charles was intrigued by his grandson's formal request for a private audience. When they met in the king's study, George presented his case with a maturity and eloquence that impressed his grandfather deeply. He explained Thompson's situation, the Guard's years of dedicated service, and the impossible choice he was facing. But George didn't just present the problem. He also proposed a solution that demonstrated remarkable understanding of both palace operations and human nature. He suggested that Thompson be granted a special compassionate leave that would allow him to retain his position while caring for his wife. During his absence, his duties could be covered by temporary assignments and overtime shifts distributed among the other guards. George argued that Thompson's 15 years of exemplary service had earned him this consideration, and that showing such compassion to a dedicated employee would actually strengthen the loyalty and morale of the entire guard unit. He pointed out that other guards would be more committed to their service, knowing that the palace truly cared about their well-being in times of crisis. King Charles listened carefully to his grandson's presentation, asking thoughtful questions about the practical implications of such a policy. He was struck not only by George's compassion, but by his growing understanding of leadership principles. The young prince was learning to balance human needs with institutional requirements. After their meeting, King Charles consulted with palace administrators and security chiefs about George's proposal. The idea of establishing a formal compassionate leave policy for long-serving staff members was discussed and refined. Within days, a new protocol was established that would allow exceptional employees like Thompson to take extended leave during family emergencies while maintaining their employment status. When Captain Morrison called Thompson into his office to explain the new policy and inform him that his request for compassionate leave had been approved, the guard was overwhelmed with gratitude and disbelief. He had prepared himself for the worst, expecting to lose his position and face an uncertain future during his family's time of greatest need. Thompson's reaction to this news revealed the depth of his character once again. Instead of simply feeling relieved about his own situation, he immediately asked Captain Morrison if this new policy would help other guards who might face similar challenges in the future. His concern for his colleagues, even in the midst of his own crisis, demonstrated the kind of person he truly was. George watched from a distance as Thompson left Captain Morrison's office with tears of gratitude in his eyes. The guard immediately called his wife to share the good news, and George could see the weight of impossible choices lifting from the man's shoulders. Thompson would be able to care for his wife during her treatment without sacrificing the career he had built through years of dedicated service. The implementation of Thompson's compassionate leave also created an opportunity for the other guards to demonstrate their own character. When they learned about their colleague's situation and the new leave policy, they immediately volunteered to cover additional shifts and responsibilities to ensure that security standards remained high during Thompson's absence. This voluntary response from the guard unit proved George's earlier prediction about strengthening morale and loyalty. The guards were inspired by the palace's compassionate treatment of Thompson and responded with increased dedication to their duties. They saw that their service was valued not just as labor, but as contribution from human beings whose personal lives and families mattered to their employers. Mrs. Patterson and other longtime palace staff members were equally moved by these developments. Word spread quietly through the palace community about the new compassionate leave policy and the circumstances that had led to its creation. While no one knew about George's specific role in advocating for Thompson, everyone could see that the royal family was demonstrating genuine care for the people who served them. For George, seeing Thompson's relief and the positive response from the guard community confirmed his growing understanding of effective leadership. He had learned that true authority came not from commanding obedience but from earning respect through compassionate action. He had also discovered that solving one person's problem could create systems and policies that would benefit many others in the future. As Thompson prepared for his extended leave to care for his wife, he took time to personally thank each of his fellow guards for their willingness to cover his duties. His gratitude and the knowledge that he could return to his position when his family situation stabilized made this difficult time more bearable for everyone involved. The young prince had orchestrated a solution that preserved both Thompson's dignity and his future, while also creating lasting positive change for the entire palace community. It was a masterful example of quiet leadership that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. 3 months passed while Guard Thompson was on compassionate leave, caring for his wife during her experimental treatment. During this time, the palace community had rallied around his absence in ways that demonstrated the true spirit of teamwork and mutual support. The other guards had seamlessly covered his duties, and regular updates about his wife's progress circulated quietly among the staff. George had continued his expanded education about social issues and community service during this period, but he often found himself thinking about Thompson and wondering how the treatment was progressing. The young prince had learned to balance his natural empathy with the understanding that sometimes the most helpful thing he could do was to step back and allow situations to unfold naturally. The news that everyone had been hoping for finally arrived on a crisp spring morning. Thompson's wife had responded remarkably well to the experimental treatment, and doctors were optimistic about her long-term prognosis. Thompson would be able to return to his duties within the next few weeks, bringing an end to this challenging chapter in his family's life. Captain Morrison shared this good news with the guard unit during their morning briefing, and the response was immediate and heartfelt. The guards had been genuinely concerned about their colleague's situation, and their relief was evident. They had proven during Thompson's absence that the palace security team was truly a brotherhood that supported each member through both professional and personal challenges. As preparations began for Thompson's return, George found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired since that first morning, when he had noticed the guards' distress. The young prince had learned invaluable lessons about observation, compassion, advocacy, and the far-reaching effects of caring leadership. George had also gained a deeper appreciation for the complex web of relationships that made the palace community function effectively. He had seen how one person's well-being affected many others, and how thoughtful interventions could create positive changes that extended far beyond their original purpose. The day of Thompson's return was marked by a quiet celebration among the palace staff. There were no formal ceremonies or public announcements, but there was a palpable sense of joy and completion as the guard unit was reunited. Thompson looked healthier and more at peace than he had in many months, and his gratitude for the support he had received was evident in every interaction. During his first week back, Thompson requested a private meeting with Captain Morrison. In this meeting, he did something that surprised everyone who heard about it later. Instead of simply expressing gratitude for his compassionate leave, Thompson proposed the creation of a peer support program within the guard unit. Thompson explained that his recent experience had taught him how isolating personal crises could be, especially for people in positions that required them to maintain stoic professional facades. He suggested that guards be given training in recognizing signs of distress in their colleagues and resources for offering appropriate support and guidance. This proposal impressed Captain Morrison greatly, as it demonstrated that Thompson's challenging experience had not diminished his commitment to service, but had actually expanded his understanding of what service could mean. The guard was proposing to use his own difficult experience as a foundation for helping others who might face similar challenges in the future. Captain Morrison brought Thompson's proposal to the attention of palace administration, where it was received with enthusiasm. The idea of peer support programs was already being implemented in other organizations, and adapting such a program for the unique needs of palace security staff seemed both practical and valuable. George learned about Thompson's proposal through conversations he overheard between his parents, and he was deeply moved by this development. The guard's response to receiving help was to find ways to help others, creating a cycle of compassion and support that could strengthen the entire palace community. The young prince realized that he was witnessing something remarkable about human nature and the power of positive experiences to inspire further positive action. Thompson's story was becoming more than just an individual success. It was becoming a catalyst for systemic improvements that would benefit many people for years to come. As the peer support program began to take shape, George volunteered to help with some of the research and planning aspects that would be appropriate for someone his age. He worked with palace staff to study similar programs in other organizations and to identify the specific needs and challenges that palace employees might face. This involvement gave George additional insights into the complexity of managing a large organization while maintaining high standards and caring for individual employees. He began to understand that effective leadership required constant attention to both big-picture goals and individual human needs. The implementation of the peer support program also created opportunities for other positive changes within the palace community. Staff members began communicating more openly about challenges they were facing, and supervisors became more skilled at recognizing and addressing problems before they became crises. Mrs. Patterson, observing these developments from her position in the kitchen, often commented to other longtime staff members about the positive changes she was seeing throughout the palace. She noted that the atmosphere had become more supportive and caring, with people looking out for each other in ways that went beyond their formal job responsibilities. One afternoon, as George was walking through the palace gardens, he encountered Thompson during one of the guards' breaks. For the first time since this entire journey had begun, the two had a direct conversation that lasted more than a simple greeting. Thompson spoke with genuine warmth about how much he appreciated working in an environment where people truly cared about each other's well-being. He mentioned that his recent experiences had taught him valuable lessons about asking for help when needed and offering help when possible. George listened carefully to Thompson's reflections, learning from the perspective of someone who had experienced both crisis and rescue. The guard's insights about community, support, and resilience were lessons that the young prince knew he would carry with him throughout his life. As their conversation concluded, Thompson did something that caught George completely off guard. The guard looked directly at the young prince and said quietly, "Thank you for seeing me." At first, George wasn't sure what Thompson meant by this comment, but as he thought about it later, he realized that the guard had somehow understood that he had been noticed and cared about during his time of struggle. George never confirmed or denied his role in Thompson's story, but the guard's simple acknowledgement meant more to him than any formal recognition could have. It was confirmation that his quiet efforts to help had achieved their intended purpose, supporting someone who needed assistance while preserving their dignity and strength. That evening, George reflected on how much he had learned and grown through this experience. He had discovered that true leadership often worked behind the scenes, that compassion required both empathy and practical action, and that helping one person could create positive changes that extended far beyond the original gesture. The young prince had also learned something important about respect, that the greatest respect he could show someone was to see their worth, understand their struggles, and find ways to support them without diminishing their inherent dignity and strength. 2 years had passed since the events that transformed both Guard Thompson's life and Prince George's understanding of leadership. The changes that began with one young prince's compassionate observation had grown into lasting improvements throughout the palace community. The peer support program was now fully established. The compassionate leave policy had helped several other staff members through difficult times, and the overall atmosphere within the palace had become notably more caring and supportive. George, now 13 years old, had continued to grow in wisdom and empathy. His expanded education about social issues had given him a broader perspective on the challenges faced by people from all walks of life. He had visited hospitals, schools, and community centers, always observing carefully and learning from every experience. The young prince had also maintained his practice of paying attention to the people around him. Though he now did so with greater skill and subtlety, he had learned to recognize signs of distress or struggle in others while respecting their privacy and dignity. Most importantly, he had developed the judgment to know when and how to offer help in ways that truly benefited the recipient. Guard Thompson had become something of a legend within the palace community. Though he remained as humble and dedicated as ever, his story had inspired other staff members to look out for each other, and his leadership in the peer support program had helped numerous colleagues through various personal challenges. The guard's experience had proven that receiving help gracefully could be just as important as offering it generously. On a particularly meaningful day in late spring, an event occurred that would bring the entire story full circle in a way that no one could have anticipated. Palace administration announced that Guard Thompson was being promoted to the position of senior guard trainer, a role that would involve mentoring new recruits and helping to maintain the high standards of the Queen's Guard. This promotion was based purely on Thompson's exceptional service record, his leadership qualities, and his ability to inspire and support his colleagues. The timing was particularly significant because it represented not just recognition of his professional abilities, but acknowledgement of the personal growth and wisdom he had gained through his recent challenges. George learned about Thompson's promotion during a family dinner conversation, and he felt a deep satisfaction that was different from anything he had experienced before. He was witnessing the long-term positive consequences of compassionate action, seeing how helping someone through a difficult time had ultimately strengthened them and positioned them to help others. The promotion ceremony was a small, dignified affair attended by palace officials and Thompson's fellow guards. As George watched from a respectful distance, He saw something in Thompson's demeanor that captured everything he had learned about quiet strength and genuine leadership. Thompson accepted his promotion with evident gratitude and humility, but he also used the occasion to speak about the importance of supporting each other through both professional and personal challenges. He mentioned that his own recent experiences had taught him that true strength often meant knowing when to accept help and how to use that help to become better able to serve others. In his brief remarks, Thompson also spoke about the values that made the palace community special, values of service, dedication, and mutual support that went beyond formal job descriptions. He emphasized that everyone, regardless of their position or title, had the ability to make a positive difference in the lives of their colleagues. George listened to these remarks with deep appreciation, recognizing in them the wisdom that Thompson had gained through his journey from crisis to recovery to leadership. The guard had learned lessons about resilience, community, and service that would now benefit everyone he trained and mentored. After the ceremony, as George was walking through the palace gardens, he encountered Thompson once again. This time, their conversation was longer and more meaningful than any they had shared before. Thompson spoke about his new responsibilities and his excitement about helping to train the next generation of guards. The senior guard also mentioned something that touched George deeply. He said that his recent experiences had taught him to pay closer attention to the people around him, to notice when someone might be struggling, and to find appropriate ways to offer support. Thompson had learned the same lessons about observation and compassion that George had been developing, though from a different perspective. As their conversation continued, Thompson shared his philosophy about service and leadership. He spoke about how the most important aspect of protecting the royal family was not just physical security, but creating an environment of respect, dedication, and mutual support that honored the values the monarchy represented. George realized that Thompson was describing exactly the kind of leadership he hoped to provide when he eventually became king. The guard's insights about seeing and caring for individuals while maintaining high standards for the community were lessons that would serve the young prince well throughout his life. Near the end of their conversation, Thompson made a request that surprised George. He asked if the young prince would be willing to occasionally speak with new guard recruits about the values and expectations of serving the royal family. Thompson explained that hearing from a member of the royal family about the importance of service and community would be inspirational for new guards. George was honored by this request and agreed to participate in the training program when appropriate. He realized that this would give him opportunities to share some of what he had learned about leadership and service, while also continuing to learn from the experiences and perspectives of the guards themselves. In the months that followed, George did indeed participate in several training sessions with new guards. These interactions gave him valuable practice in communicating about values and expectations while also reinforcing his own understanding of what effective leadership looked like. Thompson's success as a trainer was evident in the quality of new guards he helped to develop. His combination of high professional standards and genuine care for individual development created an environment where recruits could excel while also learning to support each other. A peer support program continued to evolve and improve, helping staff members through various challenges and strengthening the overall palace community. The compassionate leave policy had been refined based on experience and was now serving as a model for other royal residences and government organizations. As George reflected on everything that had transpired since that first morning when he noticed Thompson's distress, he felt grateful for the lessons he had learned and the positive changes that had resulted. He had discovered that leadership was not about commanding from a position of authority, but about seeing clearly, caring deeply, and acting wisely to support the people around him. The story of Prince George and Guard Thompson had become a quiet legend within the palace community, a reminder that compassion, respect, and quiet strength could create positive changes that extended far beyond their original scope. It was a story about the power of seeing people truly, understanding their worth, and finding ways to support them that preserve their dignity while addressing their needs. Most importantly, it was a story about how true nobility was measured not by titles or ceremonies, but by the willingness to use whatever advantages one possessed to make life better for others, especially those who served faithfully and quietly without seeking recognition or reward. Years later, As George continued to grow into his future role as king, he would carry these lessons with him, always remembering that the greatest strength often came from the quietest acts of compassion and the deepest respect for the humanity in every person he encountered.